On the 26th of January each year in New Delhi, the largest democracy in the world celebrates its independence from Western rule. The Republic of India is one of 3 new nations which now occupy the subcontinent that was the very heart of the greatest empire the world has ever known, the British Empire. The British were there for about 250 years. They came to be fascinated by it. Many of them had a special affection for India. Many of them believed that affection to be returned. They came to rule the largest single group of non-Europeans ever ruled by Europeans. An enormous variety of races and peoples, speaking scores of different languages and dialects. With them, the British brought Western civilization. Can the legacies of the West ever be laid aside? If you've once accepted them, can you ever do without the dangerous gifts of the West? Under British rule, the subcontinent was united. Responsibility for the whole of it was centered here, in the India Office in London. At its height, the British Empire in India was ruled, at least in theory, from this room, indeed from this desk, which was the desk of the Secretary of State for India, the man who stood at the end of thousands of miles of communications which tied the British cabinet here in Whitehall to the Viceroy in India, and beyond him went on to reach the thousands of district officers, tax collectors, judges, soldiers who kept the show on the road. And was it just a show, as some have suggested? Was it just the most glittering of all the baubles in the imperial crown? Just a joyride for all those thousands of officers and officials? I don't think it was. I think it was something more. It was more, too, than mere dominion. Of course, many Europeans then thought that the clearest expression of the triumph of their civilization was, in fact, imperial rule, and India was certainly the supreme example of that. But the Raj rested also on collaboration as well as upon conquest. And that meant that it was the most remarkable example of the interplay of civilizations. India is vast, as big as all the countries of Europe put together. 1,000 miles east to west, 1,500 from the Himalayas down to the south, with huge contrasts of climate and terrain. And that sprawling continent was, for centuries before Europeans arrived, the seat of complex cultures and great civilizations. It had fostered and sheltered great religions, above all, Hinduism, whose roots go back 3,000 years before Christ, and whose fatalistic and contemplative nature and mysterious customs so puzzled and sometimes shocked the first Europeans in India. They found a land of magnificent memorials, carvings embodying the great stories of the Hindu scriptures, like this relief of Shiva's descent to the Ganges. These gods and demons, men and animals, were carved in about 600 AD, at a time when it's doubtful if any part of Western Europe could have matched work on this scale. Often, the great temple complexes are built around huge tanks for ritual bathing and washing, part of the tangle of custom, ritual, and practice prescribed by the religion which was the fundamental binding force of communities throughout the entire subcontinent. When the first British arrived in India, early in the 17th century, roughly speaking, the northern half of it was ruled by Muslims, the Mughal emperors, originally from Afghanistan. Their rule spread the teaching of Muhammad. One of them, the Emperor Akbar, built this city, Fatehpur Sikri, at a time when Elizabeth I sat on the throne of England. The English visitors wondered at it. Hindus and Muslims didn't always get on, and and their divisions were to make conquest and rule by Europeans easier. The Mughal Empire was to give way to the British Raj, which was to leave its own imperial monuments. In 1906, at the height of the Raj, India's rulers decided to build in Calcutta the Victoria Memorial, a huge monument and museum of British imperialism. Outside it still stands the statue of Victoria R.I., Regina Imperatrix, Queen Empress. Her soldiers had stripped the last Mughal emperor of his title in 1857. A few years later, she adopted it. That title, borne by her successors until 1947, still evokes the powerful myths of imperialism. One important date in the British story in India is 1639. A far-sighted English merchant then took a lease on a strip of the eastern coast now called Madras. Thoughts of empire or imperialism were far from the minds of the first British in India. They came not as conquerors, but to make money. Organized as the East India Company, here in Madras they opened a trading post. It grew across the centuries. First, its trade was in coffee and textiles, less glamorous than the exotic dealings of the Dutch in the Spice Islands or the Portuguese in Japan, but growing in value and importance. In time, the traders became soldiers. At Madras, they built Fort St. George, a blockhouse of British power in southeast India. They'd got involved in local politics and wars. Above all, they were increasingly confronted by the French. A man who had gone out to India as a lowly clerk helped the British merchants to win that struggle. Robert Clive, who lived here in Fort St. George. Clive took up soldiering, at which he proved very good. In 1757, he won one of the decisive battles of history at Plassey, just north of Calcutta. Plassey meant that India's future would lie with the British, not the French, and that the East India Company would cease in time to be just a trading organization and would become the government of India. Clive was not romantic about India. He never spoke any Indian language with ease. He saw India just as a source of money, and he held Indians in contempt. But other Englishmen were to think quite differently. They saw other, more exalted opportunities in India. For a long time, the English had kept their religion to themselves. Churches like St. Mary's in Fort St. George, where Clive was married, were built for their use, not for the Indians. In the 18th century, missionaries were even discouraged. Then things began to change. People began to awake to the evangelistic potential of a vast continent offering a rich harvest of souls. The result is still to be seen all over India, in hundreds of churches, from the neoclassical imitation of St. Martin's in the Fields in Madras to Gothic revival in Calcutta, where the cathedral looks like the one at Canterbury. Urge among Europeans to bring Christian light to darkness, help to the benighted, spread with growing vigor throughout the 19th century. Its old missionary hymns are still sung today. In the early 19th century, a growing number of Europeans were coming to think for quite secular reasons that things could be made better, that they could and ought to be improved, that progress was possible. And there were always some who believed that in British India, one source of such progress should be the state and the actions of its officials. There's no typical British ruler of India. They came in too many varieties. But this statue commemorates one of the most individual among them. Lord William Bentinck, son of a duke, as a young man, governor of Madras for 5 years, and then for 7 years, from 1828 to 1835, Governor-General first of Bengal and then of India. Bentinck was an original, a man of ideas. Not all his ideas were as successful as he hoped. He wanted to consult Indians more about improving the law. He wanted to get more of them involved in higher administration, and he only had partial success in that. He even seems to have cherished the dream that Indians and British might intermarry and so at some day form the basis of a new nation, and that wasn't the way the future went. He did better when he reformed the revenue, when he appointed more Indian judges to high court positions, when he introduced and encouraged steamboats in Indian communications. He thought that they would help to dispel what he called the universal darkness of the Asiatic mind. But above all, he is remembered for the abolition of sati. Sati was the custom of burning the widow alive on a Hindu's funeral pyre. And, like female infanticide and child marriage, it was a practice which appalled many Englishmen, whether they felt they were upholding the principles of Christianity or simply maintaining civilized standards against barbarism. This inscription was written by a famous historian, Macaulay, who himself served in Calcutta on Bentinck's council. There, I think, is the key sentence, whose constant study it was to elevate the moral and intellectual character of the nation committed to his charge. That fits what was later called the trusteeship idea of imperialism, the theory that government of a subject people couldn't be justified unless it was government for their benefit, and Bentinck certainly believed in that. Behind all he did in India, there was a vision much more striking and radical than just one of endless paternalism. Paternalism was just a means to it. The vision was of an India which would one day step forward to take its own place on its own feet as an independent nation. How is it to be done? Well, he was a child of his time. He took universal values from his evangelical Christianity, from his belief in progress, from his confidence in Western education. Those were to be the things which would slowly, gently mold India for an independent future as a nation. Bentinck's confidence was premature. It was to prove dangerous to tamper with Indian custom in the name of progress. Many Englishmen believed they had learnt that in 1857 from the traumatic experience of the Indian Mutiny. That's the name the British gave to a series of outbreaks right across northern India. Indian sepoys had been provoked to mutiny by, among other irritations, the introduction of a new type of cartridge, greased, it was said, with animal fat which both Hindus and Muslims alike believed to be ritually polluting. The British fought back ruthlessly and successfully with the indispensable help of loyal Indian soldiers. One celebrated episode was a long siege of an isolated British garrison at Lucknow. Out of the ruins of the Lucknow residency, myths were born to inspire future Indian patriots and to fuel British distrust of Indians. The mutiny was a psychological watershed. And in another way, it marked the end of an epoch. It ended government by the East India Company. The Governor-General now became the Queen's Viceroy, responsible to the British Parliament. In effect, the Indian Empire had begun. The old company armies now disappeared. The Indian Army was born. Its proverbial brotherhood and esprit de corps were to make it a key institution of the Raj, one without which it could not have maintained itself, for the few British soldiers in India were always outnumbered by thousands to one. The Indian Army was more than just a military machine. It was a channel of modernization, providing access to Western techniques and technology. It also embodied the British idea that an army should stay out of politics. And while respecting the restraints of tradition, family and caste, it provided opportunities for social advancement. The army was also one of the channels which helped to spread the British ideal of physical fitness. Many Indians felt that through self-discipline and devotion to the manly sports, they could perhaps come to meet their masters on a more equal footing. Ironically, they were encouraged in this by British viceroys, soldiers, teachers, missionaries. Ironically, because sport is, after all, often associated with ideas of patriotism and nationalism. Indians took enthusiastically to the British cult of games, and often to the moral ideas which went with it. A British contribution to the physical welfare of Indians expressed itself also in concern for health and hygiene. Hospitals were founded both by the government and the church missions. They were visible evidence of the power of Western science and skills. Their impact on the immensity of India's misery could only be tiny, but such things helped to change traditional societies. Hospitals provided new occupations too, and opportunities for further education, not least for women. Industry mattered even more in providing new jobs, training in new skills. But economic progress had more than one side. India was a vast potential market for British manufactured goods. On the other hand, Indian mills took over the machinery and the systems of work perfected in Yorkshire and Lancashire and came in this century to threaten their British equivalents. Small craft industries might be eroded, but the new factories grew. None were more sure than the British railway builders that technology meant progress for India. The Victoria Railway terminus in Bombay speaks volumes for their self-confidence. Built on the site of an old Hindu temple, it's a riot of Anglo-Indian Gothic, the equal of any of the great civic buildings the Victorians put up the world over, a new temple to a new god, technology. The architects and engineers who came out to make careers in India were men who, like the missionaries, were sure they could put India on the right lines. If Christianity was for all men, so was Western technology. The result was a network of railways throughout the continent, the communication system which still articulates India today. Railways made government easier. They could move soldiers about, but they also moved other Indians about, mixing up regions and peoples, creating new markets, breaking into economic isolation. For a long time, engines, equipment, permanent way were all built in England, bringing no economic benefit to Indians, critics would say. But there are other elements to the equation. Training and experience for thousands of Indians, for example. The railways were one of the shaping forces of modern India. Some of the British placed their faith not in technology, but in education. Bentinck's Council, prompted by the historian Macaulay, decided to begin the public provision of English education and Western knowledge in India. Macaulay wanted to create a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions we govern, a class of persons, Indians in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, morals, and intellect.
But ships are but bawds, sailors but men. There be land rats and water thieves and land thieves. I mean pirates. And then there is the peril of waters, winds and rocks. The man is, notwithstanding, sufficient. 3,000 ducats. I think I may take his bond.
Just think a bit. Just think a bit. What would you do if you were in Bassanio's place?
As Macaulay had hoped, Indian boys were thus brought into contact with the forefront of Western culture.
For what we are about to receive May the Lord make us truly thankful for Christ's sake.
So, education along English lines fed the minds of those who one day would aspire in their various callings to be leaders of India. They would go on from here to universities. The first three were founded by the government in 1857, the year of the mutiny itself. Some went to England too. In the universities, these future leaders of India would go on to ask unsettling questions. Those leaders were often much shaped by their English education and owed a lot to it. From their English teachers, their English books, they got ideas about nationhood, about reform. Reading Shakespeare, they learnt what patriotism was. From John Stuart Mill, liberalism. Magna Carta and the common law gave them ideas about what were the rights of free men. Now, notions like these were dynamite in India. India could tolerate the social superiority of the Brahmins. It was part of the age-old Hindu view of the cosmos. But the new rulers, the British, said that all men really were equal. Why then? Asked the Indians whom they taught. Didn't they treat them as such? The British had pickled a rod for their own backs. But it was less highly educated Indians from poorer families that were in the end most needed by the British government. It wanted clerks, bookkeepers, supervisors, bureaucrats, rather than Macaulay's elite. Victorian administration was, after a fashion, transplanted to India, where it still flourishes in places like this, the Ministry of Information in Calcutta. Red tape may not have been the most liberating of British gifts to India. Nevertheless, it created employment and patronage which had not existed before. But for a long time, the British resisted the entry of Indians into the upper branches of administration and government. So, resentments festered, as advancement for the ambitious Indian was often frustrated. Those resentments grew and friction between governors and the governed became more and more visible after the mutiny, as British society turned its back increasingly on India. It began to be a thing mentally, even physically, apart. Bentinck's ideas of partnership were increasingly forgotten or thought unrealistic. It was he who had set the fashion of bringing the government in the summer to Simla, a hill station 7,000 feet up in the foothills of the Himalayas, where it could escape the heat in the plains below, to a life as much like that of the English home counties as possible. In Simla, the British could put down for a while their sense of responsibility, what Kipling called the white man's burden, the moral, purposeful side of the empire. That drove many English men and women through lives of discomfort, hardship, and ill health, often to early graves. The white man, they were taught, was only to be justified by his works, not by any innate superiority, by what he ought to do, not by what he was. It was a much more elevated ethos than the down-to-earth search for trade, which had got the British into India in the first place. Here in Simla, though, officials and their wives and families could find recompense for a while. There were parties, picnics in the shade, amateur theatricals. Simla society was only the apex of the pyramid. The leaders of a British India of district officers, magistrates, policemen, teachers, missionaries, doctors, even the despised box swallows, the businessmen, all of whom made up the huge complex of channels through which Western influence filtered to millions of Indians. On top of that pyramid sat the Viceroy himself, a solitary, remote, august figure. One Viceroy, Lord Dufferin, dabbled in architecture, and the Vice-regal lodge was the result. Scottish Elizabethan, but with a view of the Himalayas. One day, when times had changed, Gandhi would be received here. Places like the Vice-regal lodge played a part in convincing Indians as well as the British that their rulers were here to stay. Self-confident buildings went up in all the great cities. Pretentious, pompous, decorative, grandiose, full of moral certitude, nowhere more visible than here in Bombay. And it was in that era, in 1885, again in Bombay, that there was founded the Indian National Congress, one day to rule an independent India. The tide was slow to turn. Even a quarter century later, there seemed scarcely a cloud in the sky when, in 1911, George V, Queen Victoria's grandson and King Emperor, landed here in Bombay at the gateway of India. He and his queen were on their way to an imperial durbar just outside Delhi to receive the homage of India and her princes. At that moment, the Raj was a splendid spectacle. The tensions and ambiguities within it were forgotten. The landors of the royal procession and the sovereign's escort of lifeguards, no doubt sweating in buckskins and breastplates even though it was December, were from Europe. Around them were thousands of Indian sepoys, turbaned and patid. The ceremony was a magnificent blend of East and West. It was a conscious use of imperial mythology and symbolism for purposes of government, like a medieval English king's solemn crown-wearing. Yet, within a year of the Durbar, a bomb was thrown at the Viceroy, wounding him badly. Terrorism could be mastered, but a growing demand for more Indian participation in government was harder to contain. In 1919, sepoys under the command of Brigadier General Dyer fired on an unarmed crowd who had assembled illegally at Amritsar. Hundreds were killed. General Dyer had thought that he would teach the Indians a lesson, so that there would be no second Indian mutiny. Many Englishmen, Kipling among them, approved. In fact, Dyer's career was finished, but he had inflicted a mortal wound on Indian confidence in British goodwill. In the First World War, India had been taken into the struggle simply on the word of the Viceroy, unconsulted. The Indian Army and Indian industry gave valuable service to the Allies. "70,000 Indians died, and their names are inscribed on the All India Arch. Many of their countrymen believed they'd been promised and deserved greater acknowledgement than that simple record. The arch was part of a huge post-war architectural undertaking. The British had announced at the Durbar that the capital of India should be moved from Calcutta to the capital of the old Mughal emperors, Delhi. It was an architectural commission to rank with Versailles. Sir Edwin Lutyens, the most famous English architect of the day, designer of the cenotaph and a viceroy's son-in-law, got the job. At the heart of his design, he placed a splendid palace for the viceroy. Throughout, he sought deliberately to fuse East and Western style to reflect the idea of partnership. The buildings took 10 years to put up. The Raj was to occupy them for only 16. Near the Viceroy's palace is another building, which now houses the Parliament of India, the Lok Sabha. Its planning is evidence that by the 1930s, parliamentary democracy was not only the goal of many Indians intent on winning independence through the political machinery the empire had supplied, but of many of its British rulers too. Congress had been founded with the help and approval of British friends. It only slowly turned towards ideas first of home rule under the Crown, then of national independence. Between the two world wars it came of age. As more elections gave it wider scope and as it sensed its power, it grew more and more formidable. Its patronage offered access to jobs and power. It benefited from constitutional concessions too. By 1939, though the Viceroy still conducted defense and foreign affairs, almost all the other powers of the Raj were shared with Indians. British legislation had brought national politics into being. Many Congress leaders were lawyers. They'd often learned their law in the Inns of Court in London. They'd adopted the principles of equality under the law from the British. And they'd learnt how to argue their case as equals with the British, too. Mohandas Gandhi had been a law student in Victorian London. He went on to practice in South Africa, and there he denounced racial discrimination against Indian immigrants. He did so in terms of Western liberalism, even of Christianity. Is this Christian-like? Is this fair play? Is this justice, he demanded? Is this civilization? Later, as he surveyed the means the British in India took to defend their rapidly weakening position, he said, "This is unjust, subversive of the principle of liberty, and destructive of the elementary rights of individuals on which the safety of the community as a whole and of the state itself is based." That was a model statement of Western liberalism. Gandhi became the leader of Congress. He was a master propagandist and tactician. He knew the value of the symbols to be drawn from Indian life. He was a Hindu, but by no means orthodox. He'd read the Sermon on the Mount and would quote from that to his own advantage. His tactics of passive resistance did not appeal to everyone. India is a violent country. In politics, he believed in freedom from foreign domination, socially in the breaking down of caste barriers and outdated custom. He believed Indians should live as close to nature as possible, spinning and weaving. He wanted a peasant society of self-supporting workers with simplicity as its ideal. The state was to be a loose federation of village republics. The Western emphasis on consumption and productivity had no appeal for him. He wanted everyone to have employment. The work available in any society, he said, was limited and static, and if one person produced more than his share, it would cut into the work of another. And so the influx of Western technology and mechanization and the factory system was just as much a threat in his eyes to the agrarian values of old India as was imperial arrogance. He once said, "India is being ground down, not under the British heel, but that of modern civilization." Gandhi's choice of Nehru as his successor in Congress was a fateful decision. Nehru, too, was a Hindu. He was a Brahmin, an aristocrat, a member of the highest Hindu caste. He'd been sent away to be educated in England, first at Harrow, then at Trinity College, Cambridge. Like Gandhi, he'd been called to the bar. Intellectually, Nehru became a Western radical and a very vocal advocate of progressive ideas in Indian politics. "I am convinced," he once said, "that the only key to India's problems lies in socialism, not in a vague humanitarian way, but in the scientific, economic sense." By coupling socialism and science like that, he was invoking the very shibboleths of Western progressive culture. Nehru himself sometimes wondered where he stood. I have become a queer mixture of East and West, out of place everywhere, at home nowhere, he wrote. But India clings to me. Behind me lie in the subconscious racial memories of 100 generations of Brahmins. The Second World War seemed to give Indian nationalists their opportunity. Angered by India's commitment to war once again without reference to them, the Congress politicians first withdrew their cooperation in the war effort, and then, as Japan hammered at the gates of the Raj in 1942, threw themselves into a Quit India movement. The British arrested thousands, Gandhi and Nehru among them. There was the all-too-familiar pattern of riot, bloodshed, and British countermeasures. But for every Indian in prison, there were thousands ready to serve in the civil and armed services. Of course, the Raj had always depended on collaborators. Millions of Indians had served it and worked for it. And they hadn't seen the Raj as an enemy or an oppressor. To them, it had been a patron and a friend. It had offered jobs, education, protection, social advancement, economic opportunity. And now it was offering political power too. By 1939, most of the government of India in its provinces was in the hands of the Congress Party. The civil service was largely Indianized. Pretty clearly, it was getting near time to go. The only question was, when? In the end, the question was settled by the war, as were so many other questions. By the end of 1945, there was in power in London a Labour government committed to independence for India. Its Russian and American allies looked on approvingly. They wanted to see the end of the Indian Empire. And the British people were tired, economically, militarily, and perhaps emotionally no longer prepared to pay the price of empire. And so the end came, and the British went. It was not a very glorious moment, but in 1947, 3.5 centuries after the first of them had stepped ashore in India, the British went home. In the end, said one Indian, they washed their hands of India, like Pilate. So the last of the King Emperors sent out the last of the Viceroys, his cousin, Lord Louis Mountbatten, at the behest of a government which, by one of the ironies of history, was headed by the old Haileyburyan, Clement Attlee, to hand over the Raj to Nehru, the old Harrovian. Because the astrologers couldn't agree an auspicious day, independence was to be declared between days, at midnight. It seemed a reassertion of the old Indian ways of doing things. But when Nehru spoke to his people, it was in English.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Tragic disappointments soon followed. Partition had been accepted as the basis for independence, and the British Indian Empire was split in two. An independent Muslim state, Pakistan, was set up in the north. It had been born out of fear. The fear that Islam would be swamped in an independent India where an impartial imperial ruler no longer held the ring. 2 million Hindu and Muslim refugees set off to join their co-religionists across the border. Hundreds of thousands died in massacres. It seemed the final evidence of the artificial nature of the unity imposed by the tour de force of British rule. It was a bitter blow for Gandhi. He had above all stood for reconciliation. When he died in 1948, murdered by a Hindu fanatic, Mountbatten, sitting cross-legged in the Hindu fashion, joined Nehru amidst the hundreds of thousands by his funeral pyre. The India that Gandhi didn't live to see was not one of which he would have much approved. Nehru's goals of modernization on Western lines and industrialization were not his. Nevertheless, the new Prime Minister, his friend and disciple, mourned him.
Friends and comrades, the light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere. Our beloved leader, Bapu as we called him, the father of the nation, is no more. And that is a terrible blow, not to me only, but to millions and millions in this country.
Just outside Delhi is the field where, in 1911, that grand ceremonial Durbar was held. It's not much more than a wasteland now, though a lonely monument stands there in commemoration. Yet in Delhi itself, much that the imperial regime implanted remains. At independence, India aspired to take over the strong central state machine of the British, to inherit the apparatus and prestige of the Raj. And she took over much else as well. India today is still the most important carrier of liberal and democratic political ideas in Asia. She's held on to her democracy, even if, at times, she seemed to do so only by the skin of her teeth. The Indian hero Aziz, of Forster's Passage to India, published back in 1925, says to his English friend Fielding, "If it's 50, 500 years, we shall get rid of you. Yes, we shall drive every blasted Englishman into the sea. And then, you and I shall be friends." Well, perhaps. Though the British and the Indians never got each other quite right, in the end, neither could they quite get out from under each other's skins.